Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne Ryan and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people today who feel disengaged at work than people who feel engaged. We come from Narrative, which is a company that employs a 7-step listening and storytelling method to help engage stakeholders everywhere. Now, we also have this podcast where Julienne and I have been having conversations about leadership and engagement, and we've been having lots of different guests over the last year and a half that we've been doing this. And today we're really happy to have another guest. His name is Alex Seiler. He goes by Alex, and he's a global people leader with over 15 years of experience transforming people functions and putting talent first at WeWork, Blue Shield of California, NBCUniversal, Time Inc., and Citi. He's currently serving as Chief People Officer at GHJ, overseeing people, workplace experience, and internal communications. Under his leadership, GHJ recently won the Transform Award for People Activator Employee Experience of the Year. Outside of his day job, he acts as a strategic advisor to 3 startups, Change Engine, Kindred Minds, and When Insurance. There's a lot more to say, and we'll have a great conversation about this. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
And Jules, hi.
Hi, always great to see you, and welcome, Alex. We're so excited to talk to you. What a portfolio. That is amazing. Do you sleep?
I get asked that a lot, and occasionally I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a good segue to our topic.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe Alex, you could tell us. I severely truncated your bio. Sorry for that.
No, totally fine.
But I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey of, where do you come from in the world, and also, how did you get to this position of Chief People Officer? What was the journey towards that?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I appreciate both of you having me on here. I knew when we first connected that this would be a great conversation. So really glad to be having it with both of you. So I believe in all things diversity because I like to think of myself as all things diversity in a lot of ways. So I was actually born and raised in Hong Kong, spent the first 21 years of my life there. My parents are European, my mother is British, and my father is Swiss. And basically my parents ended up there because of my father's career, which was in the hospitality industry. So they spent over 30 years in Hong Kong. And then I went to university. That was the only time I really left Hong Kong in the UK because I followed the British curriculum while I was in Hong Kong at international school. So it was always kind of expected I would go to university in the UK. Then I returned back to Hong Kong for 6 months. And briefly worked, was trying to figure out, like most people coming out of school, what I wanted to do with my life. And then I came across a program called the Mountbatten Internship Program, actually, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, but basically, well, Jules, you do know it. That's great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's a great program. And basically, it allows you to spend a year living and working in New York. And then basically taking that back to your home country, which in my case, I don't know what my home country would be, to be fair, and using those skills and knowledge for another job. I'll be honest, having grown up in Hong Kong and with friends who come from all over the world and who went to university in places like New York, I always had aspirations though to stay in the US longer. So that 1 year, I felt like I really wanted it to be much longer than that. And now almost 20 years later, I'm still in the US. So I ended up spending 13 and a half years in New York, which I love, 2 years in San Francisco, not so much. And then the last 3.5 years in Los Angeles, which I feel very settled in right now. So when I got to the US, as part of Mountbatten. Initially, they set me up with a role that was not HR related at all. I didn't particularly love that job. And then they set me up with Citigroup and an HR role, specifically in HR information systems. And I was one of those people that like fell into it, basically. It was just luck of the draw. But it is interesting looking back at school, there was an HR management course I did as part of my A levels, and I got 100 out of 100. And there was a personality assessment I did in high school that also said that. So it's funny how when you look back at all the linkages, it kind of does bring you back to the same place. So you kind of need to listen to the signs. And so basically, you know, my career in HR started with Citi, and basically between good work, good luck, stars and the moon aligning, they ended up sponsoring my visa to stay on beyond the year. And I got promoted a few times. And then the recession hit in 2008. And as you can imagine, financial services was not a great place to be.
No.
And so I thought from both a professional and personal standpoint, it was time to make a move, right? And so I decided to pivot into advertising, completely different industry. It was also very strategic in my mind because I didn't want to just be accused of being this corporate finance HR professional. And so I wanted to try out a creative sphere. The other piece is that going into advertising, they were willing to sponsor my green card. So I actually got my green card when I moved over to work for Ogilvy and Mather in advertising. So that was a smart career move in many ways because it opened me up to, frankly, more industries and employers because they were like, oh, this individual can, you know, work in different places, right? Different environments, different landscapes. And it also meant, I hate to say it, for people that have been on a work visa, I didn't feel handcuffed to an employer anymore, right? Which is really tough when you know, because, you know, there are times where you're like, I don't particularly love where I work, but I don't really have a choice if I want to stay in the US long term. So that definitely opened me up to a lot more opportunities. And from there, I really just moved across different industries, everything from publishing to entertainment to healthcare to you name it. I covered a lot of different industries, and intentionally, because I feel like I've learned different things from different industries. And it's not to take away from people that have stayed in one industry. I just personally love the diversity of industry and what I've learned from each and how I can apply that knowledge to new experiences as well. I think it was my last role before this when I was at a company called Control Risk, which is a global risk consulting firm, that I really realized how much I love to transform and build as well, which is why I think I ended up in the chief people officer role. I sometimes consider it more like the chief transformation officer, the chief well-being officer, depending on what you call it on a certain day, because obviously the pandemic and dispersed working and things of that nature have changed the world so much as well. I think the other thing is that, you know, is I love to make things better at a very grassroots level. But part of that is, and I said to somebody the other day, I don't know if that's about having ultimate control, right? And I think in this role, what's so great is I'm empowered to do my job, which frankly is scary on one level, because obviously if things don't go the right way, I'm ultimately accountable. But I love that. And I've garnered the most respect in my career through owning up to my mistakes or my team's mistakes, right? But the other thing is when things go right, you are the reason, you and your team are the reason that happened. Kind of similar to, you know, the outcome of the Transform Award, you know, really was because of the incredible team that I've built, you know. But I also think it's also the fact I love this work and where I am in particular, because I can leave an imprint. I'm also in an organization that's at 240 people where I can see the direct impact of my work. When you work at bigger organizations, in my experience, like I have in my career, it's very hard to do that, right? You can massage things, you can gently change them, but you can't really shift them considerably like you can in smaller organizations. So that's got me to where I am today. And I think what's great, in addition to my day job, I love to do things like we're doing today. I love talking on podcasts. I love speaking. I love writing. I find it highly cathartic. I also like to listen and learn from other people, which is why I think what you do at Narrative is so exciting as well. Because all I talk to my team about is listening and the importance of storytelling, especially when it comes to our business as well.
With that, a couple of words came to mind as I was listening to. First, a phrase that I coined some time ago was called story tourism. And which you have definitely done, because you've been a visitor, not just through countries, but cultures in different parts. And I was sitting there going, okay, if you went from Hong Kong to coming to New York, did they put you out in Long Island City when you were working in Citi?
No, some people were in Long Island City, but I was actually, my office was actually, I was always in Manhattan, different offices in Manhattan, but always Manhattan. But it was funny because our accommodation during the Mountbatten program was in Jersey City. And it's funny, some people work for UBS and they were going to Connecticut. So I sometimes called it the tri-state internship program.
And that whole areas have transformed and changed quite a bit. So that was a little bit like being in the Outback sometimes. But also the fact it's cultural anthropology. When you're coming into an organization and you're not immersed in that business, it's a little intimidating sometimes because you don't know all their jargon. But you start to realize that is part of the gift too, because you pay attention differently. So I just had to comment on that. And you did a great job of answering the question every New Yorker asks, how'd you get here? So there you go. Okay.
And I would also say, when you were speaking, Jules, it also helped for me to think, the first thing that came to mind is, it is so interesting how different the work landscape is now. And Jerome, you touched on it at the beginning relative to then, like that was my first corporate job when I was in New York and I was at Citi. And to think now these days, people are stepping into quote unquote corporate jobs, but they might be doing it from their living room. And it's so different now. And so for me, that would have been really scary. I'm sure it is for people today, but also exciting. So it's just interesting to see how the world has turned. And I mean, some people might think 20 years is a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing, right?
Right. Yeah, it kind of gets boiled down into these bite-sized, series of years or experiences, right? And when you put them together, it seems like a long time, but actually, the concentrated time is in one place isn't that long. And I'm wondering, given what you just said about the changes, and you have been around in this field for a while, even though it's been in different industries. What have you seen? What do you see today that is kind of the main lesson of the last couple of years, let's say, especially with the pandemic? And you touched upon, people now having to, or not having to perhaps, but maybe they have a choice to work from home. How has that changed how you viewed your own role and how you guide people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's exciting is, for example, is how the values of my current firm, GHJ, really align with my own, which I think is so important as a chief people officer in particular. And we talk a lot about remaining fiercely independent and also fiercely flexible. And so, and we were flexible before it was hip to be flexible, before everyone was talking about, remote working. We were already doing it, right? We didn't do it as a result of the pandemic. And I think that's also what I've learned. People just want choice and optionality and flexibility. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be forced to do something that they don't akin to. Like today I'm at a WeWork, for example, right? Yesterday I was in the office. The other day I was working from home. That works for me. That might not be for everyone. Some people like just working from home. Some people like being in the office 5 days a week, like my boss does. It's different for different people. And I don't think there's a prescribed way of doing it. And like I say to my team it's the results that matter. Your location doesn't at the end of the day. And I think people have learned that, who were even cynical pre-pandemic about that piece as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I still love in-person connectivity, but I think that's the big difference. We come together as a firm twice a year. Actually, it's coming up in May for what we call firm-wides, and then again in December. But it's actually about building in-person connectivity, not for FaceTime, right? And I think that's the key difference. Like, having worked in fields like banking, and as we've all seen in the news, banking is now requesting, a lot of the big financial services firms are requesting employees to come back to the office 5 days a week, right? So, which is, again, it's a choice that they're making, but it's not a choice for employees, because now they're being forced and told, hey, you kind of like it or lump it. This is the way you've got to do things. So I do think that limits, I personally wouldn't take that approach, because I think it limits your talent pool. I think, one of the things we've learned at GHJ is we went where the talent is. Now, granted, I work in an industry where there are fewer and fewer accountants out there, because there are less people taking accounting degrees. So the supply and demand doesn't line up. So we had to go where the talent was, which I think was a smart approach. The one thing that we're learning, though, is we may have gone to too many places, right? And so now we're in certain states where we only have 1 or 2 people, and trying to create employee engagement that way is really hard. So we're starting to create what I'm calling a market hubs concept, where we create critical mass in certain areas. So where we've got more employees, and they can come together in person for things like town halls, community engagement events, things of that nature, general check-ins, right? Lunches, things of that. So I think part of my other learning is it's not a one and done. We keep learning, we keep evolving as we try and test things, right? But what I love about where I am right now is it aligns with, I'm a big, fail fast. If it doesn't work, move on, but you're not going to know until you try. So those have been some of the important lessons for me. And I don't want a prescribed way of working now. If somebody told me or approached me about a job, frankly, and said, well, it would have to be done this way, I'm like, well, you've already taken choice out of my hands.
It has to be 100% like this or 100% like that.
Correct.
It's interesting that, first of all, just to reflect a little bit on that, I love what you just mentioned, that strategy of the market hubs, and it kind of, it sounds like you very much have your finger on the pulse of the people in your company, right? And I think this is something we've talked a lot about on this podcast with people in similar positions, but even other roles. That how important it is to keep your finger on the pulse, and not sort of only be looking outward in terms of how are other people doing things, which is also important. You have to know, how it works, but that, it's a strategy that seems so right-sized for where your organization is at, and has been thought about in that way. And I think for our listeners, that's a real nugget, in terms of a strategy, thinking about how to strategize around people and employee engagement in particular. The other thing I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on it a little bit, because I think it's fascinating, and I think many people do not get this distinction. The distinction between FaceTime and in-person connectivity. You said, we have these events and it's about in-person connectivity and not FaceTime, and so many others, it is about FaceTime. Could you elaborate a little bit on that difference?
Yeah. So, I'll use a couple of examples, but I think, at its core, I think when I think of FaceTime, I think of those moments where we were expected to be at the office at 8 or 8:30, right? Almost just to be seen. And to be seen to be working, where in my experience, the people that typically turned up at that hour spent an hour having their breakfast at their desk. They weren't actually doing any tangible work, right?
Hey, I was, because I was
okay, Jules.
That's funny. I was about to.
You were the minority in my world. Okay.
Yeah, I was about to say I was definitely the person who was having their breakfast for an hour.
Before the knocking on the door.
Exactly.
Or what? Not even the door was closed. It was doors open, which is they come flooding in.
But it created.
But go on, Alex. We're willing to listen to you.
Yeah, at least
now that we've gotten that out of us.
I appreciate that. But it does. I think it does create a false perception. It created a false perception that, for some people at least, if I wasn't in the office as early as my colleagues, I wasn't necessarily as productive or did as much, right? And again, it goes back to why I think results matter. When I say in-person connectivity now, I'll use an example. So my team that I built at GHJ, we have a weekly people team meeting. And my team is literally, it's, at this point, is literally about 50-50 between what I call in the greater LA area versus remote, right?
Right.
So for the people that are actually in the greater LA area, like myself, we try to come in person for that meeting every week. Plus, it doesn't hurt that it's free lunch on a Wednesdays through Grubhub. It's, food always gets people in the door.
Absolutely.
And then, right. And then everyone else is on video. But what's nice is about that is it's our way to kind of come together and bond as a team and even see each other through video or talk to each other in person, maybe have those conversations that you can't necessarily always have over a Zoom, a little trickier, sometimes you want to have a confidential conversation and you want to really do that in person. So it's for reasons that are not FaceTime related. And the nice thing about our firm-wide meetings is they're really built on connection. It's like, and the thing that we hear more and more from our people, and our focus for May, is building cross-functional connections. A lot of people are saying, hey, we now, through Zooms and other things, we know a lot of people in our practice areas or departments, but how do we get to know people in other departments? And that's harder to do just through Zoom. Like, it's way easier sometimes to be like, hey, why don't we grab a coffee during a firm-wide and better understand like who you are as a person? What do you do? So I think it's things like that maybe in the past we either didn't think as much about or we took for granted.
Yeah.
That's so interesting and important, because that's how learning happens. Yes, you have learning programs, but so much of, like, especially in the HR field, you learn by showing up at the table. You might be I've had interns, you've had managers, to listen how things are happening in backstories and perspectives, and to get a bigger view, even if it's not on their shoulders to fix. So I do agree. It's those small moments, the walking down the hallway moment, you're grabbing a coffee, and you just, you can turn to somebody and have a chat and just have that little bit of an exchange. I don't need to see everybody all the time, because you probably work with vendors and staff. Just getting a face and an energy the next time you deal with them on the phone, because I remember the video call period. And it built trust, and it just was like, okay, now I have a better sense of you. And what you're about. I think you're making a good point. It is a learning academy both ways, because staff is also giving a perspective and showing you things we don't really pay attention to, or look at a different way.
Agreed. And I think you make a good point there, Jules, on trust. I mean, I implicitly have to trust in terms of the work that my team does. And I think we use obviously video to talk about the day-to-day stuff, but it's nice when we can come to a firm-wide and also potentially have a lunch or something else saying, what's going on in your personal life? Is there anything I could be doing differently? Which is harder to do sometimes once you're going through the day-to-day and all the operational pieces, right? So it's just, I think, using in-person connectivity for different types of conversations.
Yeah, and making it much more, what I'm hearing is that it's much more intentional than perhaps it used to be, right? Because I remember when I was, coming out of business school and was doing an internship, and it was at the water cooler that I heard about an opportunity to actually go to Hong Kong, and I ended up spending almost 5 years there. Had I not had that conversation at the water cooler, which was with someone who was not from my department, that would not have set up this chain reaction, right? And so if I was in today's kind of market and I was working remotely for an organization, I don't know, perhaps, you have to make those kinds of opportunities happen, or create the space. And that's what it sounds like you're doing, is essentially creating a space for people to meet and chat, and not just in your department, but elsewhere. So you're kind of recreating this water cooler experience that we completely took for granted, I think, and suddenly disappeared, for many of us during the pandemic. So that's great. And actually, I think maybe that there might be a link there to what you're talking about, but you can confirm that with employee well-being, which is another subject that comes up a lot in our podcast, and that leaders have had to pay attention to a lot more, it seems, or certainly there's more headlines about employee well-being as part of, the whole employee engagement strategy. Could you tell us a little bit about what your view is on that, and how you see your role as Chief People Officer, what is your role as a facilitator of that?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked this question. So it's very near and dear to my heart on a personal level. So first of all, mental health is particularly something that's near and dear to my heart. Because without having a healthy sort of, mental mindset, it's hard to bring your full self to the workplace every day. And so, on a personal level, it's really been really important because I've struggled myself with depression and anxiety during my career. And it's a reminder that growth is not linear, right? It's very up and down. I had a few years where I felt like I should have been further along in my career than where I was because of the anxiety and depression I was dealing with. And, I would say to anyone who's listening to this, if you're going through something like that, give yourself some grace, because you will come out on the back end of it better for it. And I've learned a lot in my career about my imperfections, way more than the things I did well. The imperfections have made me a better leader as well. So, but I think for me, being able to carve out and figure out what is important to me from a self-care perspective, working out is really important for me, not just with my trainer, not just from a physical standpoint, but actually really for the endorphins and from a mental health. It puts me into the right frame of mind for the day. Probably not surprising with my background, traveling and exploring new places is a place of, where I feel very content and relaxed. And I think for everyone it's different. So finding what it is for you, first of all, on a personal level. I think on a professional level, why it's so important to me is that there's a couple of things. Now we're in a dispersed workforce. We can't see people every day. So we don't necessarily know what people are going through. But we can figure out how we can provide tools, resources, things of that nature for people to have available to them. So one thing, I'll use an example. Accounting is a very interesting industry because they go through busy seasons, right? And so, and we're just coming out of a busy season right now for tax, and audit is about to do the same. And people are working 60, 70-hour weeks during that period. And you can imagine all they want after that is to take time off, right? I mean, it's not the best for their mental health. And so one of the things we've instituted is a wellness week. We did a couple of days last year, and this year, the week of July 3rd, we're taking a wellness week where the entire firm will be shut down. And which is great because it also means nobody comes back to a slew of emails. Because I think that's our other fear when you go on vacation. Like, what am I coming back to? Right? Is the other
crying
thing.
On the plane.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. You're crying on the plane. And again, knowing that there's certain periods of the time where they can't take time off, at least that guarantees them the time to take time off, right? And reset. The other thing is, last year we spent over $350,000 investing in our benefits, and part of that was really an investment, including in that around our mental health benefits. Obviously increasing our contribution of what the employer pays versus the employee, and making things like therapy and other things really affordable at no cost to the employee as well. So like I said, I just want people to know that we're thinking about them and the potential things that they may need. And look, not everyone's going to use it, not everyone's going to need it. But the fact that goes back to my point that there is choice and optionality is what's important. And look, I think luckily in the US compared to other countries, there's less of a stigma around things like mental health and therapy. But I still think in certain parts of the country, we still need to normalize it. And so part of it for me in my role is talking about it, highlighting it, and actually, frankly, the fact that I've gone through mental health issues myself, I think that people can say, hey, if a chief people officer goes through that, it's fine that I do as well. And also, if I'm not at my best, I can't show up for my team in the same way either. So you've got to put your mental health first.
I want to comment on that, and thank you for being so honest and forthcoming about your own experience. That does make a difference when people are engaging. There's a huge trust factor, though, whether you have the most amazing benefits program, is people being nervous about using, because say, what is this information to do that? What does this set me up for? Here's the positive, I get this, but what's being tracked, what can be used? It's just a natural thing. And how do you build that trust? Especially you're in a smaller organization right now too. It's one thing if it's thousands, but it's not at that number.
That's a good point. I think it's a really good point. And I think the way we do it is in tandem with our values and our culture. So Jules, I think to your point, like we talk a lot about psychological safety. And I think, I think it's become a very buzzy word, as we all know, right? So, but what's more important is how do you take that buzzword and actually apply it to your culture? And I think that's what we do a good job of, is basically saying we want to have the uncomfortable conversations. We want you to show up as a as a participant, not an audience member, and challenge the status quo, right? And we really do live those values. I've got to be honest, even when I turned up, I was like, wow, I'm allowed to sort of, the guardrails here are way different to my last firm, and I can push things and say things, and it's going to be okay. I think part of the hard thing, though, initially for people, Jules, to your point, is depending where you come from, seeing is believing. So I wasn't initially a believer. I was like, I need to see this. And when I saw it, then I became a believer. But I think for people that haven't experienced that level of psychological safety, and I've even seen it on my own team, because people come with trauma from other, frankly, other employers or companies or in their careers, seeing is really believing in that situation. So we've tried to weave that psychological safety story as a common thread and connective tissue with everything that we do, including our benefits, consistent people communications, and that we're an employer who wants to do things like that. Same goes for our cohort strategy or employee resource groups. We encourage people to sort of test the limits, right? And really ask the tough things. So I would say, if we were just saying this about our benefits, people might be like second guessing it more, but considering we talk like this in every type of meeting or context or environment, there's more believability. Now, don't get me wrong, doesn't happen immediately, but over time and repetition, people get there for sure.
Right. It's like you're bringing all of that to life, and it's like embodied when I witness it. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. The other thing that you said reminded me of something that we often say too, which is that, everything begins with the individual. It begins with you. And so you coming out with your own story, will encourage other people to A, listen to you. That's the first thing. And B, trust you. And maybe they'll tell you their story too. I think that's the kind of cycle that we've seen, certainly. And it's great to see you kind of living by that motto that we often employ ourselves. I wonder, Alex, if since we are you went kind of from the personal to the professional with this example of mental health and how you deal with that at work. And again, I think for our listeners, there are so many great nuggets here of wisdom and insights, just the wellness week and things like that, shutting down the office. I think it's such a great idea for others to perhaps be inspired by. But I want to go back to the personal and ask you a question that we ask of all of our guests on this podcast. And so I'll ask you as well, which is if you could tell us about an experience that still shapes who you are today, still resonates with you. You've gone through many, many different iterations, it seems like, over the years, but I wonder if there's an experience that kind of sticks and that you could share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to name the employer.
Okay. I like the way this starts.
Yeah, not going to name the employer, but, to know me, and my team would say, one of my superpowers, I'd say at this point in my career, at least, not always the case, is giving ongoing real-time feedback. You always will know where you stand with me. I don't want anyone to be surprised. So, and as cliche as it sounds, I truly believe that feedback is a gift. Now, in my career, I did work at one company, and I received feedback from a leader. And at the time, I'm going to say I felt like it was the most useless feedback I'd ever received in my career. And I frankly was like, I don't know what to do with this, except I definitely want to leave. So, but looking back on it now, it was actually the most useful feedback in hindsight that I'd ever received. And so the feedback that I was given was, Alex, you like to hold people accountable, but this is not a culture where people like to be held accountable. And so I stood there and I took that in. I was like, well, how am I meant to do my job effectively then? How can I measure my success? How can I measure your success? How can I measure the business's success?
And not to mention the fact that it went against your value, right? Because you talked to us
totally, absolutely. So accountability, as I mentioned earlier, is so front and center to who I am. And again, I said, like, my current firm, I'm so aligned with the values and the mission of the organization. Once I heard that, and again, also it was counter to what the company espoused, I was like, I don't see how I can continue to work here. Now, fast forward, I will say that company ended up making some changes, and one of the focus areas for their leadership team ended up being accountability. So I think at least they recognized where they were going wrong. I didn't foreshadow that. I'm just saying, it was interesting it got to that point. But the reason why it's so important is it really dictated from that point on that I needed to work somewhere where people either aspired to or already did hold their people accountable. And what's exciting about where I am now at GHJ, one of the three growth pillars we're focused on right now? Accountability. So one is accountability, one is upskilling, and one is knowledge sharing. And guess who is leading the accountability pillar from a leadership team perspective? That would be me if you put your money on it. So it's just funny. It's funny how everything comes full circle, you know.
And and you know, I appreciate you telling that story because people sometimes hesitate to come forward with what may seem like a moment of failure. Right. Like this was a moment when you didn't like what you heard, you had to leave, you know. And so if we left the story there, that's maybe what some would surmise, or mostly we're the ones who are surmising ourselves about our own experiences and saying, oh, that was a failure. That's terrible. I'm never going to talk about that again. I don't want to think about that again. But actually, when you looked back on it, that can no longer be seen that way. You know, it actually maybe never even was seen that way in your mind. It's just, you know, something that happened and then you moved on. And now you're able to see in hindsight, wow, look at where I am now and how that's become such a spotlight, you know, a value to spotlight for me, where I know that I'm either going to manifest that value in the world or I'm going to stand up for it. So what a great moment to recognize. And I think that's another great insight for our listeners. You know, pay attention to those moments. You know, don't discard anything just because of some perception that you have of it.
When you look at history in the last 20 years of 2008, other situations, the companies that made headlines for not being accountable on their business, would that is such a great tagline that you make accountability trendy. Like that your accounting firm in-house is looking at themselves as well as that's got to play into their customers and their relationships and stronger business practice. And that is something uplifting to hear.
It does. And
it gives you hope. That somebody's trying to be accountable.
Totally, because
holding.
And if you think about it, it cuts across everything. Like, how are we meant to have transparent conversations if we can't hold people accountable, right? How are we meant to give accurate, timely feedback if we're not holding ourselves accountable to doing that? So it just in my opinion, in my experience, everything falls apart very quickly if you don't do things, or, you know, or if you work in environments, which I have, where you've got that sort of pass the buck mentality, or finding a scapegoat, because it's way easier to do that, frankly, than actually stand up and say, oh yeah, I didn't do this, or I didn't own this, or I didn't take accountability for this. And what people miss is, like, that's where you get respect, right? I remember in my career where, frankly, somebody on my team made a massive boo-boo. first of all, what I didn't do was throw them under the bus, because at the end of the day, the person reported to me. But I said to the leader, hey, this happened. I gave that person feedback and coaching. It's never going to happen again, I'm sure, in their career, because they've learned their lesson this way. But at the end of the day, I take ultimate accountability. And what they said is, thank you. I respect you for coming forward and tell. Obviously, it's awful this happened. I never want this to happen again. But thank you for doing that. And it also made me safe knowing that I got that kind of reaction. But I also think, I don't know, as I don't know if it's age or moving along in my career or not caring. I don't know what it is. But like I've become more fearless versus fearful. And I think there was a point in my career where I had, like I said, when I was dealing with anxiety and depression, where, you know, I felt like I had imposter syndrome. And I also felt like it was harder to speak up about certain issues. Whereas now I feel like if I don't, I'm holding in things that other people might be feeling as well. And I'm doing a disservice to myself and to others.
So you're bringing this up, circle back to a word and a phrase I put down a few minutes ago. What made the difference? What made the difference of that imposter and some of the things that was able to move you forward?
So I think what made the difference, there's not one silver bullet. I think there were a couple different things. One thing was, first, I appreciative that one employee in my career, I asked for an executive coach and they got me one. I found that super helpful, but I was invested in that. That's what I knew I wanted. And I found that as one thing to be super helpful. The other thing I learned, Jules, that was super important was I feel like I was failing and I had imposter syndrome at one point. It goes back to what I was saying before, was I would challenge things and say, why are we doing things that way? And one of my pet peeves would be, oh, because we always have. Why are you asking? And then I would be told, okay, well, can I do it this way? No, you've got to do it this prescribed way. And I'm like, well, my brain doesn't think that way, right? And so I found that when I had to follow somebody else's way of doing things, especially something that I didn't understand or I wasn't invested or aligned with, I couldn't do it well. Now I'm in a position where, frankly, I'm driving the narrative. And I can do it with my team the way we think it should be done. And that's what's created a recipe for success.
Yeah. And I really appreciate what you said. You know, my brain doesn't work that way. I think that's such an important kind of empowering moment to realize that, you know, you're saying that to yourself, but then when you're able to actually say that to other people, and that's probably the fearlessness, right? Is that we're so fearful that we're going to be judged because of what we're saying, and, you know, or the way we think that may be a little different from the status quo. And especially when people are saying, no, don't do that, right? When you're in an environment that would probably be deemed an environment that was not psychologically safe for you, right? Because you're not being allowed to think the way you need to think. And so I think these are hugely important points for people to kind of realize, you know, are you in an environment that allows you to speak your mind and speak your heart? And then can you find the resources that you need? You know, how helpful are people in your company, like the one that said, you know, yes, sure, we'll get you an executive coach. You know, I think this is such a great conversation in terms of reminding people of all the things that you can actually do. You know, that all it takes is I shouldn't say all it takes, but, you know, it takes the courage to be able to speak up and to recognize all these things. And I'm hoping that people who listen will be able to recognize things thanks to your insights and your experiences, because they're so precise and specific. And I really appreciate that. There's no question there. It's more a comment.
Thank you. No, and I'm a big believer in practical, tangible takeaways. I always say, even when I do speaking engagements or other things, if you're looking for somebody that's going to just give you highfalutin concepts, it's not me. Like, I'm the one who you will leave the conference or whatever speaking engagement and say, oh, I can figure out now whether any of these apply to me or not. Maybe none of them do, but at least I've given you some takeaways, right? And that's why I always used to be so frustrated when I had to listen frankly, to conversations that would drone on about these high level concepts. I'm like, what am I meant to do with this? Like, how am I meant to apply this in any way? You know, I might as well have gone and read a textbook, frankly, right? It's more about people really want to understand, like, what has worked for you and what hasn't in your career, right? And it can change.
Right. Yeah. Being open to change. Jules, do you have any other questions? I'm looking at the time.
So what would be, you're on the virtual podium right now. I'll let Key take. This is your moment.
This is my moment.
You're in Hollywood right now. So this is your Hollywood camera.
See, Jules, that's the problem. You're an active listener. So now I've set you up for that question, you know? So there's a couple things I would say. I've never believed more in the concept of a team within a team. If you are a leader of any kind and you're trying to build a team, trying to foster engagement, you need to build a team within a team. And when I say that, what I mean is everyone needs to know enough about what each other is doing. So you can not only build connection and camaraderie, but also from a business continuity perspective. So they know enough to be dangerous about each other's jobs. Right. And that is probably my number one. And my team say it all the time now. And, you know, initially when I took this role, my team is completely different now. I think some people are like, well, why do I need to know about this other person's job? And it's been so illuminating to see my current team be like, I'm getting all these aha moments, like my job connects or is interdependent to this person for that reason. So I can't say it enough that is critical. My other one is don't make assumptions, ask the question. I cannot stand when people say, well, I believe, I think. I was like, have you asked? Ask the question. Don't go in without context either. And that's the other thing. I've never gone in to change something without getting context and understanding the past, because I can't dictate the future if I don't have that background. That's why I really get in my career when I've seen leaders come in and be like, I have a better idea immediately. Let's rip out everything. I'll be like, well, let's see if you're here in 6 months if you try and do that. So those are my couple, Jules. How did I do?
You did very well. And I agree with you on each one of them, because that's some of my favorite words and phrases too. So excellent job.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, so many insights. Really appreciate your perspective, and yeah, I appreciate having you on the podcast. If people want to find you, Alex, what's the best way to do that? Is it through a website or LinkedIn, or what's your preferred way?
LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me. So it's linkedin.com/IN/Alex Seiler. So ALEXSEILER. I go by Alexandre with an RE also on LinkedIn. If you like spicy hot takes on things, then I try to provide plenty of them. But like I say, I'm always my authentic self, and LinkedIn is a place where I feel very free. And I also think the other reason why you'll see that for those that choose to follow me on there, I post a lot because during the pandemic, it's become a community when we couldn't always see other people, where you could find like-minded individuals that share similar perspectives. So LinkedIn is my go-to. I know it's different for other people, but that's where you can find me.
Great. Fantastic. Excellent. And we'll make sure to put that in our episode notes as well. Well, again, I want to thank you, Alex, for being on the show and sharing all your wisdom and insights. Like I said earlier, really so many practical, tangible things that people can take away from this. So I really encourage our listeners to go out and implement some of these things. I also, as always, want to thank our listeners and ask you to not forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, because that's what drives the word of mouth. And also to let you know that on our website, you'll see that we have a 3-part workshop series that we developed. Alex talked to us about the importance of listening and storytelling, and is kind of an embodiment of that. And you can learn how to do that yourself. We're calling it Leading with Story. It's a 3-part series, all online, and you can find out more on narrative.com, NARATIV.com, as well as ways that you can bring us inside your companies and work with your own teams to find, craft, and present stories that will engage your audiences like nothing else has before. We're always ready to listen and hear new ideas and innovate. So again, thanks so much, Alex Seiler, for being with us today. And thank you, Jules, for being my wonderful co-host once more.
Thank you. And to everybody out there, just know this one thing, it works. So call us. Cheers.
And thank you both as well. It's nice to know. I think I've got 2 new friends out of this lovely podcast.
I wish we could go out and have a drink, but you're too far away.
We'll make it happen. We'll make it happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.